Yo nityamachyuta padambuja yukma rukma vyamohata staditarani trinaya mene asmat guroho bhagavatosya dhayeka sindhoho ramanujasya charanau sharanam prapadye. Today is a very historic day, a very important milestone for Sanatana Dharma. Most of you would have been following the news. Just about an hour back, Honorable Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi, unveiled the Statue of Equality. The Statue of Equality, a supremely majestic 216 feet Murti of Swami Ramanuja, conceived by the great current day Acharya Chinnajiyar Swami in Hyderabad. Interestingly, today also happens to be a very auspicious day, Vasanta Panchami, a day dedicated to Sharada Devi. It's incidental that Sharada Devi bestowed the title Bhashyakara to Swami Ramanuja more than 1,000 years back. Very pleased with Swami Ramanuja's magnum opus, his commentary on the Brahma Sutras. Sharada Devi of Kashmira Desha, when Swami Ramanuja offered his bhashya, his commentary on the Brahma Sutras to Sharada Devi in Kashmir, the Devi was very pleased with his work and gave him the title Bhashyakara. And his commentary till today is celebrated as Sri Bhashya, the peerless commentary on the Brahma Sutras, the very essence of all Vedanta. The Statue of Equality is an outcome of tremendous planning and work carried out by the Chinnajiyar Swami over the last 10 years to celebrate the millennium, 1,000 years since the appearance of the Adisesha avatars of Swami Ramanuja. 2017 marked 1,000 years since the appearance of Adisesha as Swami Ramanuja. And today, the whole world witnesses the unveiling of the statue, aptly called the Statue of Equality. While today's culture, no doubt, cherishes equality, the equality that is talked about, highly debated, and highly talked about, highly demanded, is very superficial. Materialism clearly tells us that people cannot be equal. People are different. Whatever material metric we use for comparing people, it only shows differences. So therefore, people soaked in worldliness, with a very materialistic point of view, with a world view dominated by materialism, demanding for equality is only very superficial. the very principle of equality is not really understood at all. We can all ad nauseam debate on the need for equality, but today's society, rooted in materialism with the DNA of greed, can never achieve equality. Because we have, as long as we are cut off from the roots of Sanatana Dharma, we can at best only talk eloquently about establishing equality in public, but equality can never be achieved. Our longing for equality, we need to recognize, points to our spirituality. Therefore, without recourse to spirituality, there is no way to establish equality in the society. This is what all our Shastras teach us. Equality can only be achieved with a spiritual worldview, with a perspective, an expansive perspective of the reality of this universe created by Bhagavan. Only rooted in the understanding of the three tattvas of Chit, the sentient individual souls, of Achit, the insentient principle of matter, and the Bhagavat Tattva, Ishvara, Narayana. And Swami Ramanuja, 1,000 years back, in language that is very simple to understand to commoners, the language of bhakti, he managed to drive home this message of equality of all in the eyes of Bhagavan. There is only one relationship that is possible. All the jivas are equal and are seshas to the one Sarvaseshi, Narayana. Unless and until one understands the underlying unity, all this diversity in this universe, amidst all this diversity, there is an underlying unity. There is underlying sameness. Only when one understands the nature of the Atman within, Najayate mriyate va kadachin nayam bhutva bhavitavana bhuyaha ajo nityah shashvatoyam purana na anyate anyamane sharire. Every Atma, every individual soul, every is eternal and is a part of this one organic whole. We are all amshas. Krishna is amshi. Mamevamsho devaloke jiva bhuta sanatanaha, Krishna declares in the Gita. Until that relationship is understood, until there is awareness of our true nature, there can never be equality. So therefore, celebrating the message of equality today through the message of the great Acharya, whose messages are eternally relevant, whose speciality was that he integrated people, he integrated philosophies at the same time. Now, this is what only Adisesha can do, like Bhagavan, Aghatita Ghatana Samadhya, trying to accomplish what is almost impossible. He integrated people, integrated society. He brought everybody together. No discrimination whatsoever. Caste, creed, religion, language, no bar. He was hailed as Kripamatra Prasannacharya. Until his time, all the acharyas were called Anuvritti Prasannacharya. An Acharya accepted a disciple only if the disciple had some qualification. There were certain prerequisites to become a disciple. The Acharya demanded certain prerequisites. So therefore, until Swami Ramanuja's time, all the Acharyas were Anuvritti Prasannacharyas. Swami Ramanuja transformed this relationship between the Acharya and the Sishya. And he came to be hailed as Kripamatra Prasannacharya, ocean of compassion. To him, there was only one prerequisite: desire for moksha. Mokshatva alone was enough. No other prerequisites. Without any discriminations whatsoever, he threw open the doors of spirituality to one and all. And therefore, it's a very important day in the history of Sanatana Dharma that a fitting monument is being dedicated to the world at large. And as it always happens to us, it is just another coincidence that we are in the midst of relishing Atma Jnana and Brahma Jnana through the conversation between the illustrious Jadabharata and Maharaja Rahugana, where Jadabharata is instructing to the king on equality, how to recognize the unity of everything amidst the apparent diversity, how to recognize the sameness of the Atman within every entity, not just the human beings, every entity, living and non-living. How to recognize the Paramatman, who is the indweller, who is the companion throughout the journey of the Atman in the cycle of samsara. What a fascinating conversation between Jadabharata and Rahugana in the 5th canto of Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, filled with profound wisdom. Several riddle-like statements which are very characteristic of Vedantic messages. So Vedanta is not easy to fathom, not easy to understand. It requires sadhana. And it is through acharyas, with the grace of all our acharyas, through thousands of years, that we have managed not only to get the treasury of all books of Sanatana Dharma, be it the Vedas, the Vedanta, the Itihasas, the Puranas, the Agamas, along with these original texts, we also have innumerable commentaries where the acharyas dedicated their lives for only one purpose: to give the purport of these shastras to us in a way we can understand, relate to, and practice them even today. As we continue relishing this conversation between Jadabharata and Maharaja Rahugana, today we will cover an interesting story. So today is primarily a story time. Jadabharata is not an ordinary storyteller. We have definitely seen over the last 2 weeks that Jadabharata does not speak in easy language. But as he moves on, imparting Brahmajnana, as is the custom during those days, ancient days, stories were used to convey difficult messages. That is why in Upanishads we see a series of stories. And it is through stories that we get to understand complex principles. We get to see the unraveling of profound wisdom. Jadabharata now shares with Rahu Gana a very interesting, but at the same time, not so easy to understand story, which unravels as the storytelling goes. It seems a merchant enters a forest to acquire certain forest products, which he can sell for profit. Obviously, he is very keen in expanding his business. He enters the forest, and then the forest is so very captivating with its astounding variety. It is quite promising. The merchant is convinced this is the place to be. He is not only enchanted, he is spellbound by looking at what the forest has to offer. The kind of resources, rich resources all around, the flora, the fauna. Therefore, he is so very motivated to pursue that journey, to go deep inside the jungles in quest of wealth, to amass considerable amount of wealth. He, without really minding the kind of effort that is required, he begins to work very hard within the forest in search of various kinds of forest products, starts to accumulate them as he goes on, promising himself that as he amasses riches, sacrificing several things, not taking rest, working hard, he knows a day will come. Sooner or later, with all this that he has amassed, he is going to have a great time. But also, he is not alone. There are several other such merchants, other kinds of dwellers in the forest, and he also knows that he has to be on his feet all the time, because survival, after all, in the jungle is not easy. Now and then, he definitely gains more than he anticipated, and now and then he also loses more than he anticipated. And obviously, he is aggrieved. He's always thinking of what's going to happen, whether the next day he's going to gain more or lose more, because there are also loots happening, there are also robbery happening, there are also other kinds of activity that is going on. He also finds out that in this forest there are powerful plunderers, and Jadabharata says, to be precise, along with this merchant, accompanying him always, whether he likes it or not, 6 very powerful plunderers, he says, who constantly plunder. Whatever he accumulates, they plunder, and several carnivorous, blood-sucking animals. The more he accumulates, the more is plundered. With profit as his driving motive, this merchant, obviously, even though things are unpredictable in the forest, in the jungles, he keeps pushing himself hard and hard and hard. He wants to be a warrior, but unfortunately, he ends up to be a warrior, constantly worrying all the time, wanting to be a warrior, but was ending up to be a warrior. Wherever he went, and he kind of halted and stayed. The merchant also tried to remove the weeds, all kinds of weeds on the ground, put in a lot of effort plowing over the field, trying to clean up, uproot the weeds completely. But in the process, he also ended up, as he was also carrying a lot of flora and fauna that he collected, and he was carrying, also ended up sowing seeds as well, more and more. So the more he uprooted and the more he sowed, he ended up cultivating and growing all kinds of plants, unwanted and wanted, good and bad. In his grueling journey through the jungles, this merchant was always disturbed. And Jadabharata says, hey Rahugana, one source of disturbance for him was the cruel mosquitoes, he says. Interesting. Merchant always disturbed by cruelly biting mosquitoes all the time. Therefore, he was always in a state of, was watching out always. And sometimes the merchant sees imaginary palaces in the forest, runs after them. Sometimes he's bewildered by seeing fleeting ghost fields which appear like meteors in the sky. So therefore he keeps running from one place to the other in search, while sometimes he runs to safety, sometimes he runs after some kind of a booty, always wanting to multiply his booty. Running and wandering, sometimes his eyes are covered by dust of wind. Wind brings him a lot of dust. His eyes are covered, blinded, and he fails to recognize the right direction of the path, and sometimes also where he is heading, and he loses his track sometimes. Having lost the path and not knowing where to go, sometimes he goes in the wrong direction and gets harassed by all kinds of birds and animals. Wandering in the forest sometimes, at unwanted times, the merchant also hears all kinds of noises, invisible crickets making harsh sounds. His ears becomes very much aggrieved when he starts listening to the sounds made by birds like owls and other kinds of creatures. Sometimes he takes shelter of a tree and he finds that the tree has no fruits or flowers. Nevertheless, it goes and still takes shelter of those trees. Trees without flowers and fruits. Sometimes when he is thirsty, searching for water, he goes after chasing mirages, illusions. Caught sometimes in forest fires, he runs and he jumps into shallow river and breaks his head. Just when the merchant sometimes thinks he has overpowered his adversaries, some of his fellow merchants who are also out there trying to amass the forest products, just when he thinks he has overpowered, he is plundered or defeated by somebody who is more superior. After all, it is about survival of the fittest out there, powerful ones, and he loses his possessions. Sometimes merchant comes across hills and hillocks and he wants to climb over them, but without insufficient footwear, with the hillocks covered by sharp rocks and thorns, he gets pricked and he starts to bleed. His feet starts to bleed. He becomes very, very frustrated and aggrieved. Many a times, the merchant, Jadabharata says, gets swallowed by a python. And then there are other times when he escapes the pythons. He is bitten by snakes and he falls down into dark well. And it takes time for him to come out. Many times the merchant goes to take honey from a beehive and gets brutally attacked by the bees. Sometimes he's busy counteracting the natural disturbances, freezing cold, scorching heat, strong wind, excessive rainfall. And then Jadabharata says, afraid of the roaring lions in the forest, merchant makes friends with cranes, herons, and vultures. Quite a story. Obviously, because Jadabharata has spoken the story, I'm sure all of us would be wanting to know what the story actually means. This is not a story that is told by somebody, a fiction writer, or somebody for passing time. This is actually a beautiful allegory. Some of you possibly have already guessed what it means when it is said the merchant enters a forest, a jungle. This is the forest of Samsara. Merchant represents every jiva. And obviously, in Samsara, it is all about survival of the jiva. Survival of the fittest becomes the paradigm that rules, and the jiva is driven to accumulate, and accumulate more. When one tries and tries to possess more, when one tries to possess the material, one ends up being possessed by the material. This is law of life, whether we like it or not. The more one tries to possess anything material, the more one gets possessed by the material. On the other hand, when one lets oneself possessed by Krishna, one can transcend material possessions. Driven by a possessory attitude, wanting something more always, the jiva always is struggling in samsara, the forest of samsara, which is very captivating. The forest is very captivating. The samsara, this world, is no doubt very captivating. It makes the jiva spellbound, identifying with the products of the gunas, as we have seen. The jiva is spellbound. So very spellbound that he begins, he buys into the belief, the lie that everything is scarce, scarcity mentality. So therefore, one needs to necessarily fight it out because resources are limited, everything is limited. And it is this mentality of scarcity which sows the seed for greed, which sows the seed for always wanting for more and more and more, to accumulate more, and there is no end to this accumulation. Bhagavan's motive, Bhagavan's intent is sankalpa for the jiva is to use the material to reach the spiritual. The material is meant to reach the spiritual. The material is not meant to chase the material. What I mean by that, this body is material, made up of prakriti. It is meant for only one purpose, not to chase other material objects. It is meant to reach him, to reach the spiritual. It is meant to use what we presently value to progress towards what is our ultimate value? What we value today, obviously we all value our body, we all value our mind, we all value our intellect, we value many of our resources. Now we don't need to worry too much about renouncing these resources. While Shastras do talk about renunciation, the central theme of 18th chapter of the Gita, while renunciation is important, worrying too much about renouncing what we currently value is not going to take us anywhere. Instead, here through this allegory, Chakravarthy is basically saying it is important what we presently value and progress towards what is of sustainable value. Use the temporary to reach the eternal. Use this temporary body to reach eternal Vaikuntha. So therefore here it is very important that while being in this samsara, instead of being just enchanted and spellbound with the material, it is important to start thinking of how this material, all the resources that are provided, are actually, what is the purpose of every resource that is provided to us? There is a purpose for what? For this configuration of the body that has been given, a very, very superior configuration compared to any other configuration of any other living being. There's a purpose why the Atman gets a human body. There is a purpose why each and every one of us are bestowed with a certain amount of material resources. The purpose is to use the material to reach the spiritual. Now, this merchant, we have seen in the allegory, that is working hard in the forest, wandering, and one day he gains, one day he loses. Therefore, he is always in a state, always worrying. He's a worrier more than a warrior, worrying all the time. Very important message here is to recognize that whether we like it or not, by design, samsara, duality is inherent in samsara. Pleasure and pain are like incoming calls. Today, possibly many of us have this practice of having different sounds, different ringtones, so that we can decide whether to take a call or not take a call. Those who are our favorites, maybe we have a different kind of ringtone. Those who we may want to avoid, different kind of ringtone. So pleasure and pain are also like incoming calls with different kinds of sounds and ringtones. Now, it is very important that we should not get carried away by the sounds of these incoming calls. We have to necessarily pick up to get the message. Because what is the point in just listening to the sounds of the phone if we don't pick up the phone, we don't get the message? Similarly, we have to pick up the call. Pleasure and pain in life both have important messages. While pleasure gives us the message that there is something which is everlasting. Everlasting pleasure is awaiting. What we are experiencing now is just an infinitesimal fraction of the infinite bliss that is awaiting us. Anything good that we are experiencing today is just an infinitesimal fraction of Bhagavan's infinite glories. Every time we experience that fleeting pleasure, there is a message there. So that we don't need to get bogged down thinking that it is here that which is the source of pleasure. Similarly, every experience of pain also has a message. There is no point in trying to struggle and find everlasting happiness here in the world, in samsara. It is not possible. We need to keep reminding ourselves. So every experience of pain also has a message. Every experience of pleasure also has a message. So instead of just getting bogged down by just these pleasures and pains, the underlying message is the duality must remind us of the unchanging centrality of Krishna in our lives. Amidst this duality, there is that unchanging reality, that unchanging centrality of Krishna in our lives. And when we recognize that he is there with us, within us and with us all the time, these dualities don't matter anymore. Now, this merchant, unfortunately, is stuck, just like how instead of picking up the call, he is just stuck, either relishing a nice tune or some kind of, or he is being disturbed by some kind of a jarring sound coming from the phone. Both don't help. So Chakravarthy said in the allegory that in the forest there are 6 powerful plunderers. Obviously, the moment 6 powerful plunderers come in, we can all easily relate to what these 6 are. 5 Jnanendriyas and Manas, supposedly the superintendent of these 5 senses. Supposedly. Most often, this mind, which is supposed to be the superintendent, actually becomes subservient to the senses. No, the factory of life, mind is supposed to be the superintendent, Manas, and all the senses are supposed to be the workers that need to carry out the instructions of the superintendent, but most often the hierarchy gets reversed. And completely the senses hijack the mind, and the mind is running after everything that the senses want, which is going after the external stimuli all the time, trying to search for something, which is not going to give any everlasting, it's not going to give any solace, no peace of mind. And Chakravarthy also said the forest has several carnivorous blood-sucking animals. Very, very, very harsh words he used, difficult words, but in this allegory, these several carnivorous blood-sucking animals for the jiva are his bodily relationships. The jiva, in the process of acquiring a body, also ends up with several bodily relationships, all kinds of relationships. Now, it may sound a little brutal to call bodily relationships carnivorous, blood-sucking animals. But sometimes masters like Chakravarthy are brutal when it comes to giving out messages which are hard facts. Deha bandhutva is a limiting factor for the jiva. It is very important that every Deha bandhu has to be transformed into an Atma bandhu. Relationships are important, no doubt. But if the relationship is constrains one's spiritual progress, that becomes a limiting kind of relationship. Here, the message is not to be hard-hearted. Hard-heartedness is not the message. The message is to be clear-headed, to have clarity of perception of every relationship, how to spiritualize every relationship, how to devotionalize every relationship, every bodily relationship, mother, father, brother, spouse, child. It can, any relationship can be spiritual when one looks at everyone as inseparable parts of Krishna. And one can definitely love everyone in the process of loving Krishna. Therefore, here, the reason why the brutal words of carnivorous blood-sucking animals for bodily relationships comes because when there is that bodily attachment, the jiva gets pulled down. Whatever he accumulates eventually gets plundered in one way or the other, whether he likes it or not. And the senses ensure that he continues to perform papa karma and continues the cycle. Kavamashritya dushpuram dambhamana madantita mohat grihitva sagrahan pravartante ashuchivrataha, Krishna says in the Gita. Pravartante ashuchivrataha. One keeps going on in circles and circles, performing ashuchivrataha, impure activities all the time, driven by kama. The more he accumulates, the more he is plundered. If the profit is a driving force, and in this forest everything is unpredictable, obviously he can never be a warrior. He can never fight the war against his real enemies. He will only be a warrior. So therefore, Jadabharata here says, wherever he stayed, he didn't try to remove the weeds, uproot them. But in the process, he also ended up sowing more seeds, which again resulted in growing more plants, good and bad, sweet and sour, good and poisonous. Law of karma. We continue to keep doing actions repeatedly. Every action that we do definitely has to have a consequence. Every cause has to have an effect. Every action has to have a result. Every karma has to have a karma phala and karma vasana. And one keeps sowing seeds repeatedly all the time, and one can never come out of the cycle of samsara until and unless the seeds are burnt. So this is what Krishna in the Gita always says. The seeds, there will be seeds, there will be karma phala, but when the seeds are burned, kamagnihi daddha karmanam tamahu bandita, he says, jnanagnihi daddha karmanam. The seeds of karma have to be burnt. When a seed is burnt, then it will not blossom and grow into another new plant. In the allegory, Jadabharata also says, in the grueling journey through the forest, the merchant is always disturbed by cruelly biting mosquitoes, he says. Cruelly biting mosquitoes. Interestingly, he uses the word, he uses mosquitoes because mosquitoes are nonsense for us, a nuisance for us. Here, the message is, each and every one of us are continuously disturbed by people who are envious. The mosquito bite here is the envy. In this world where everybody is soaked in worldliness, when there is something better in the other, it naturally results in a reaction. The reaction of being envious. But there is another possible response. Instead of being envious, one can show respect and admiration. Envy is corrupting. Envy is a destructive force. While envy is corrupting, respect and admiration are elevating. But unfortunately, when one is completely identified with the body and is chasing material accumulations and looking at everyone always in the mode of relating and comparing, envy is a very natural reaction that rules everybody. And this envy is like a mosquito bite, which is constantly disturbing and distracting. Jadabharata in this allegory says he keeps running from one place to the other in search of multiplying the booty. And sometimes his eyes, while running, are covered by dust because of the wind. Very important to understand this here. When one is driven by selfishness, selfish greed, one is blinded. Selfish desires, when they rule the mind, they veil our nature. They completely cover with a thick blanket the light of knowledge within. Dhumena vriyate vannihi. Krishna says, Dhumena vriyate vannihi yatadasho malena cha. Yatolbena avrito garbaha tatha tenedam avritam. Krishna gives beautiful analogies. He says, Dhumena vriyate vannihi. Just like how a flame, a fire is covered by smoke. Yatadarsho malena cha. Just like how a mirror is covered by dirt and dust. Yataha ulbena avritaha. Just like how a fetus is covered by a thick layer of amniotic fluid. Similarly, selfish desires cover, they completely obscurate the light of jnana within. And therefore, we do not get to realize our own nature. The mind completely blocks instead of unveiling, it reveals our nature. No wonder we never get to experience our own nature as long as we are driven by selfish desires all the time. So here in the allegory, Chakravarthy talks about being blinded by the dust while he's running and running, he's blinded and he's going everywhere, not knowing where he's heading to, and he loses the path. And wandering in the forest, sometimes he hears all kinds of noises that that aggravate his mind, agitate his mind. The noise, the sounds of owls and other kinds of birds and insects and crickets, he says. Here, Chakravarthy in the allegory is referring to the harsh words of the world. Whether we like it or not, there are only harsh words that the world always speaks. Because everybody is competing with everybody else. Because everybody believes life is supposed to be survival of the fittest. That's the jungle Raj. That's the rule of the jungle. Unfortunately, Samsara is a jungle, but the humans are supposed to be outside of the jungle. Survival of the fittest is an animalistic worldview, but unfortunately, the humans have also adopted it blindly. And if survival of the fittest is the underlying paradigm of life, then obviously it's only struggle, it's only competition. It's about how the only way I can move on is when I drag down somebody else, and there can only be harshness, there can only be enmity all over. Chakravarthy in his allegory says, sometimes this merchant takes a shelter of a tree which has no fruits or flowers. That's exactly what happens to someone who is materialistic all the time. He takes shelter of somebody who is wealthy without really knowing what is the point in catching hold of another drowning man in the ocean. If a man is drowning, how can he provide us shelter? The so-called wealthy are also very greedy. Now, wealth plus greed is equal to poverty. This is the real formula. True poverty is wealth plus greed. Truly poor are those who are wealthy and also greedy, but unfortunately, it so happens that one who is always on the run in this allegory always takes shelter of such people. No use. They can not offer any peace of mind. They cannot offer any advice for real upliftment. And Chakravarthy says, very thirsty, he chases mirage after mirage. Same thing happens. We are constantly chasing a goalpost, just moving all the time. Every goalpost is like a mirage. Why chase the mirage of material pleasures, when the oasis of Krishna is with us all the time, is always accessible. So this is unfortunately the most kept secret. The door, the entry door to the oasis, Krishna oasis, the key to this is with us. But we are constantly looking out, we are very thirsty and chasing mirage after mirage after mirage. And Chakravarthy in the allegory says, not able to withstand forest fires, this merchant goes and jumps into a river, even though it is shallow. A shallow river, what happens if somebody dives into a shallow river? Breaks his head. Now, this is very much relevant even in today's world. So, trying to get away from problems and distress in life, sometimes we also take refuge of technology today. Every technology tool that today we use are supposedly our escape ways. But unfortunately, we don't realize the damage that is causing. Just like how this man dives into this shallow river and breaks his head, this is exactly what's happening by taking refuge of technology. To use technology is important, but one should not get used by technology. This is what is happening to us. The exponentially increasing distractions, all kinds of exponentially increasing distractions all around us, and the incessantly intensifying competition between these distractions. Now, I should be very happy if no one of you are compelled to look at any of your mobile phones that are pinging or messages popping up or some message coming to your laptop. Very, very difficult to get away, not being distracted by the devices, all kinds of devices all around us. Almost impossible today. Anything can wait, but not a popping sound coming from a device, leading into decreasing attention spans. Very, very damaging state. Just like how this man in the allegory dives, is trying to escape problems, dives into a shallow river and bangs his head. That's exactly what is happening. And Chakravarthy says he's plundered. More he accumulates, more he plunders. Basically saying, attempts to find solutions at the material level are like efforts of a drowning man holding on to a straw. A drowning man in ocean trying to hold on to a straw. What the drowning man needs is a lifeline, not a straw. What is the point in trying to find solutions at a material level? All efforts will go wasted. This being plundered is going to continue, just like what was happening to this merchant in this allegory. And Chakravarthy also speaks of this merchant trying to go up the hill and hillocks, but not having footwear, is pricked and is bleeding. His legs are bleeding. Essentially, here the allegory is referring to where the Shastras do give us various Vaidika rituals, yagas and yajnas and homas, various austerities that we can perform for material comforts, no doubt. But if there is no absorption in Krishna, all these rituals will become meaningless. Just like how this man will end up trying to climb these mountains with all the effort, but will end up bleeding and struggling, doing all these rituals. So absorption in Krishna is like the protective footwear, which will prevent from getting hurt. So therefore, every ritual that is prescribed and to be performed, it is important to realize that the underlying rule is all have to be performed out of love for Krishna. Absorption in Krishna is fundamental. The allegory also refers to this man being swallowed by a python. And so what does this mean for us? Python is the sleep. We all get swallowed by sleep. No, it is no problem falling asleep, but the problem is when we fall for sleep. Falling asleep is essential. Different people sleep for different purposes. The yogis sleep now and then, maybe whenever time permits for them, only for one purpose, just to bring that relaxed state of relaxation for a while. Bhaktas sleep knowing well that this body is presented, is bestowed by Krishna, and in order to serve him, they need a fit body, and the fit body needs adequate rest. But then there are those who sleep to escape from problems of life, who keep sleeping and sleeping and sleeping, getting swallowed by the python in this jungle. And bitten by snake is bitten by laziness, procrastination, indulgences of all kinds, intoxication of all kinds. Being afraid of lions, Chakravarthy in the allegory says, the man befriends cranes, herons, and vultures. Here, lion is death, afraid of death. One who is soaked in worldliness tries to take shelter of material things with a vain hope of conquering one's own mortality. How foolish. All the attempts to conquer mortality with all kinds of material shelters are of no use. And one does not realize it at the right time. Chakravarthy brings back to a point which was raised by Rahugana earlier, that driving question that he had. What is that shelter in life? What is that shelter in life? The most secure shelter in life. So through this allegory, Chakravarthy brings Rahugana once again back to that burning question. Let us pause here for a while, reflecting on this allegory. And then we will conclude Chakravarthy's teachings and also the 5th canto in the coming sessions. Until then, let us continue to reflect on the principle of equality that Chakravarthy covered as part of his discourse on Atmajnana, which coincidentally happens to be also the theme of the landmark that is being dedicated to Jagadacharya Swami Ramanuja in Hyderabad. I encourage each and every one of you to visit the YouTube channels where this inauguration ceremony was earlier today relayed. I also encourage each and every one of you, those of you who want to know more about Ramanuja, his glorious life and times, in our own Sanatana Dharma YouTube channel, you can get to dive deep into the life and times of Swami Ramanuja through an audio-visual presentation, which happens to be an audio-visual presentation of my own book called The Treasure, which was published more than 12-13 years back, and the audio-visual was published 5 years back to commemorate the 1000th appearance day of Swami Ramanuja. Starting today, the links to these will also be published in all the groups. I do encourage you, one and all, to celebrate the spirit of equality, celebrate the message of Jagadacharya. And we will continue with our journey through the 5th canto of Śrīmad Bhāgavatam. Śrīmate Ramanujaya Namah.